Patrick hadn't even shut his apartment door when he heard the knock. He turned, surprised he'd barely been here for an hour. Boxes still lined the hallway, his couch was half-assembled, and his fridge was empty. Who could possibly be here already? When he opened the door, he wasn't prepared for the woman standing on the other side. "Hey, you must be the new neighbor." She smiled, holding up a plate covered in foil. "Welcome to the building." She was beautiful, warm brown eyes, dark waves of hair pulled into a loose ponytail, and a confidence that made it impossible to look away. He cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how exhausted he must look. Yeah, that's me." She grinned, shifting the plate in her hands. "I'm Paige. I live right across the hall." Patrick hesitated, then stepped aside. "You want to come in?" She laughed. "I wasn't going to invite myself, but sure." As she walked in, he suddenly saw his apartment through her eyes, half empty, a mess of boxes, and the overwhelming scent of fresh paint. Paige set the plate on the counter and peeled back the foil, revealing still warm cookies. "I figured you might not have had time to get groceries yet." He blinked, touched by the gesture. "You didn't have to do that." She shrugged. "I like baking. And I remember what it's like to move in somewhere new. It's always nice to have someone say hi." Patrick grabbed a cookie, took a bite, and nearly groaned. "These are amazing." She laughed. "Good. Now you owe me the favor of not being a terrible neighbor." He smirked. "Define terrible." "Loud music at 2 in the morning. Stealing packages. Leaving your laundry in the communal machines for hours." "Well, I think I'll be okay. I don't steal, I sleep like a rock, and I have my own washer and dryer." She raised an eyebrow. "Impressive." Patrick found himself staring at her a little too long, and he forced himself to look away. He wasn't here to get distracted. He'd moved to the city for a clean slate, a fresh start. The last thing he needed was to get caught up in something or someone he wasn't ready for. But Paige was easy to talk to, and before he knew it, they'd spent an hour leaning against his counter, talking about everything from the best coffee shops nearby to the quirks of their apartment building. "I should let you finish unpacking," she finally said, checking the time. He almost asked her to stay longer. Instead, he nodded. "Thanks again for the cookies." She smiled. "Welcome to the building, Patrick." As she walked out, he caught himself watching her, an unfamiliar feeling settling in his chest. He hadn't expected to meet someone like Paige today, and he definitely hadn't expected to want to see her again. Patrick hadn't expected to think about Paige as much as he had in the past few days. It was ridiculous, really. They'd spoken once, shared some cookies. It wasn't like they'd had some life-altering connection. And yet, every time he stepped into the hallway, he found himself glancing toward her door, wondering if he might run into her again. His chance came sooner than he thought. It was late, the kind of late where the city had quieted just enough to make footsteps echo in the corridor. He'd just gotten back from a run, his shirt damp from the lingering summer heat, when he nearly collided with Paige outside their doors. She was carrying a stack of books, her arms full, and the moment she saw him, she let out a breath of relief. "Oh, thank God," she said, shifting her grip. "I wasn't looking forward to dropping these all over the hallway." Patrick reached for the top half before she could protest. "Where are you taking them?" "Inside," she answered, nudging her door open with her hip. "Come in for a second?" He hesitated for a fraction too long. "Unless you have somewhere to be?" she added, tilting her head. He didn't, and even if he had, he wasn't sure he would have said no. Paige's apartment was the opposite of his lived-in, warm, full of personality. Shelves lined the walls, overflowing with books and trinkets. A soft throw blanket was draped over the arm of a well-worn couch, and the scent of something floral lingered in the air. "Sorry for the mess," she said, setting the books down on her coffee table. "It's not messy," he replied, placing the ones he carried beside hers. "It looks like a home." She smiled at that, a small, knowing curve of her lips. "That's the goal." Patrick glanced around, his eyes catching on a framed photo near her television. It was a younger version of Paige, her arms wrapped around a woman who shared her eyes. She caught him looking. "That's my sister, Ellie. She lives a few hours away, but we're close." He nodded. "She looks like you. The more chaotic version of me, but yeah." Something softened in her tone, and Patrick recognized it instantly. A deep-rooted love, the kind that didn't fade with distance. He wondered what that kind of bond felt like. "You never said where you moved from," Paige said, shifting the conversation. He hadn't. And he'd been hoping she wouldn't ask. Upstate, he answered vaguely. For work. He hesitated. Something like that. Paige studied him for a moment like she could see the weight behind his words but wasn't going to push. Well, welcome to the city, she said instead. It's loud, crowded, and occasionally smells like hot garbage, but it grows on you. Patrick chuckled. Great sales pitch. She grinned. I try. They talked for a while longer, the conversation flowing easily. Paige had that effect. She made people comfortable, like they'd known her far longer than they actually had. Eventually, Patrick glanced at the time and realized how late it had gotten. I should go, he said, though he wasn't in any rush to leave. Paige walked him to the door, leaning against the frame as he stepped into the hall. Thanks for the help, she said. Anytime. He meant it. As he walked back to his apartment, he fought the urge to turn around. But he knew, without a doubt, that this wouldn't be the last time he found himself standing in Paige's doorway. Patrick had never been the kind of person to linger in hallways, but lately, he found himself pausing outside his door for just a second longer than necessary, listening for any sign of Paige on the other side of the hall. It wasn't intentional, at least, that's what he told himself. He'd spent his first few weeks in the city keeping to himself, focused on settling into his new routine, but Paige had a way of pulling people into her orbit without even trying. It had happened so naturally that he hadn't noticed until it was too late, until he found himself waiting for the sound of her voice, the chance run-ins that always seemed to stretch longer than planned. And then, one evening, the knock came. He opened the door to find Paige standing there, her expression somewhere between amused and determined. She was holding 2 takeout containers, the scent of something rich and spicy drifting between them. I got too much food, she announced, lifting the bags slightly. And I refuse to let good pad thai go to waste. Patrick leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. So this is a guilt trip disguised as generosity? She grinned. Obviously. Is it working? He stepped aside before he could overthink it. Her presence in his apartment was starting to feel familiar, like a part of his routine he hadn't realized he needed. She moved easily through the space, setting the food down on the counter, towing off her shoes like she'd done it 100 times before. They ate at the kitchen island, the conversation flowing effortlessly. Patrick learned that Paige had a terrible habit of forgetting where she put her keys, that she had an ongoing rivalry with the guy who ran the coffee shop on the corner over whether or not cinnamon belonged in a cappuccino, that she had once impulsively adopted a cat she was mildly allergic to but refused to give up. In return, she pried bits of information out of him, his favorite kind of music, the fact that he hated olives, the reason he always ran late at night instead of in the morning. You don't talk about yourself much, she observed after a while, twirling noodles around her fork. Patrick considered that. Not much to talk about. Paige arched an eyebrow, unconvinced. I don't buy that. He didn't answer right away. It wasn't that he didn't want to tell her, he just wasn't sure how to. His past wasn't something he handed over easily, and for good reason. She must have sensed his hesitation because she didn't press. Instead, she changed the subject, effortlessly steering them back into safer waters. But later, when the food was gone and the conversation had slowed, she lingered by the door, studying him with quiet curiosity. You're not what I expected, she finally said. Patrick met her gaze. What did you expect? She tilted her head slightly, as if trying to figure that out herself. Someone a little more guarded, a little less willing to let me barge in with takeout. He exhaled a quiet laugh. Maybe I'm just bad at saying no. Or maybe you don't mind me barging in as much as you pretend to. She said it lightly, but there was something else beneath her words, something unspoken. Patrick didn't answer. He didn't need to, because she was right. Patrick wasn't sure when it had happened, but Paige had seamlessly woven herself into his life. It wasn't just the occasional shared meal or the quick greetings in the hallway anymore. It was the way she knocked on his door when she had leftovers, the way she texted him a random fact in the middle of the day because she thought he'd find it interesting, the way her presence had become a constant he didn't realize he'd been missing. And yet, there was a part of him that still held back, a quiet voice in the back of his mind reminding him that this wasn't supposed to happen. He had moved here for a fresh start, not to get tangled up in something he wasn't sure he could handle. But Paige didn't seem to care about the walls he kept up. She slipped through the cracks effortlessly as if she had been meant to be there all along. One evening, as he was locking up after a late shift, her door opened and she stepped out, adjusting the strap of her bag. "You're just getting home?" she asked, her expression shifting to something close to concern. "Yeah," he admitted, rolling his shoulders. "Long day." She studied him for a moment, then glanced at the time. "Come with me." He frowned. "Where?" She didn't answer, just tilted her head toward the elevator, daring him to argue. He didn't. They walked through the quiet streets, the city humming softly around them. Paige led him to a small, tucked-away diner, the kind that had probably been around for decades. The neon sign flickered slightly, casting a warm glow over the sidewalk. "I found this place my first week in the city," she said as they stepped inside. "It's open all night, and they make the best grilled cheese you'll ever have." He glanced around. The walls were lined with faded photos, the kind that told 1,000 stories if you looked closely enough. The scent of coffee and something fried lingered in the air, wrapping around them like a blanket. They slid into a booth near the window, and without even glancing at the menu, Paige ordered 2 grilled cheese sandwiches and a plate of fries to share. "I don't think I've had a grilled cheese in years," Patrick admitted, leaning back against the worn leather seat. "Then you've been doing life wrong," she teased, resting her chin in her palm. He huffed a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "You always this bossy?" "Only when I'm right." The food arrived quickly, and the first bite made Patrick realize just how hungry he actually was. She watched him with a knowing look. "Told you." He shook his head. "I'm not admitting anything." Paige grinned, taking a sip of her drink. "You don't have to. Your face already did." The conversation drifted, flowing as effortlessly as it always did with her. She told him about the time she had gotten lost on the subway her first month here and ended up an hour outside the city. He admitted that he still had to double-check which train to take most days. Somewhere between the last bite of his sandwich and the final sip of his drink, he realized he didn't feel tired anymore. The exhaustion that had weighed on him all day had faded, replaced by something lighter, easier. As they stepped back out onto the quiet street, Paige glanced over at him. "Feeling better?" He nodded, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Yeah. Thanks for this." She bumped her shoulder against his. "Anytime." They walked back in comfortable silence, the city buzzing softly around them. When they reached their building, she hesitated outside her door, her fingers tapping lightly against the strap of her bag. "Patrick?" He looked at her, waiting. She exhaled as if debating whether to say what was on her mind. Instead of speaking, she reached out, gently tugging on the sleeve of his jacket. It was a small gesture, barely anything at all, but it sent something sharp and unexpected through him. Then, just as quickly as she had reached for him, she let go. "Good night," she said softly. He didn't move until her door clicked shut behind her. And even then he wasn't sure he remembered how to breathe. Patrick hadn't realized how much time he spent thinking about Paige until he started catching himself looking for her without meaning to. It was in the small moments, the way his attention drifted toward the hallway when he stepped outside, how he noticed the sound of her laughter when she was on the phone in her apartment, even how he started wondering if she'd show up at his door again with another excuse to pull him into her world. She had become a part of his life so effortlessly that it was only when she wasn't there that he noticed the absence. But tonight she was. He had been on his couch, flipping through the channels without really watching anything, when there was a knock. He knew it was her before he even opened the door. Paige stood there, looking slightly windblown, her cheeks flushed from the cool night air. She wasn't holding takeout this time, wasn't armed with an excuse. She was just there. "I needed to get out of my apartment," she admitted before he could ask. Patrick stepped aside without hesitation. She walked in like she had done it a dozen times before, but tonight there was a tension in her movements, something restless beneath her usual ease. He closed the door, watching as she wandered toward the window, looking out at the city beyond. "What's wrong?" he asked, leaning against the wall. Paige exhaled, crossing her arms. "I had a fight with my sister. That was new." She spoke about Ellie with warmth, with a closeness that always seemed unshakable. Patrick didn't push. He just waited. After a moment, she turned, leaning her hip against the windowsill. "It was stupid. She thinks I'm too comfortable here. That I don't take enough risks." He frowned. "What does that even mean?" Paige gave a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. "She thinks I should be doing more. Bigger things. That I should be chasing something instead of settling into a routine." Patrick considered that. "And do you think you're settling?" She hesitated. "I don't know. I like my life. I like the way things are. But sometimes." She trailed off, then shook her head. Never mind. He wasn't going to let that go. Sometimes what? She sighed, running a hand through her hair. Sometimes I wonder if she's right. If I'm too afraid to shake things up. Patrick wasn't sure what to say to that. He understood the feeling, the quiet doubt that crept in when everything seemed too steady. But Paige wasn't someone who played it safe. She was the kind of person who walked into people's lives and changed them without even trying. And she had definitely changed his. You don't seem afraid of much, he said finally. She looked at him then, something unreadable in her gaze. Maybe I am. The words lingered between them, heavier than they should have been. Patrick pushed off the wall, stepping closer. Paige! She swallowed, her fingers tightening against her arms. He could see the conflict in her, the war between wanting to be honest and wanting to pretend it didn't matter. Before he could say anything else, she exhaled sharply and shook her head. I shouldn't have come here. That hit him harder than it should have. Why not? Because she stopped herself, pressing her lips together. He took another step, closing the space between them. I'm what? She looked up at him, and for the first time since she walked in, she looked unsure. You make it too easy to be here, she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. Patrick felt something shift in his chest, something irreversible. Then stay, he said simply. Her breath hitched, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then slowly Paige reached for his hand. Patrick didn't think, didn't question it. He just pulled her closer. Patrick didn't let go. Neither did Paige. His fingers curled around hers, and for a moment, it was as if the entire world had slowed to a quiet hum. The city outside was still alive, people moving through their lives, but here in this small, dimly lit apartment it was just them. Paige's chest rose and fell in measured breaths. Her gaze locked onto his with something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't hesitation, wasn't fear. It was something deeper, something that made the air between them feel electric. He lifted his free hand, brushing his thumb lightly over the inside of her wrist. Are you really afraid of shaking things up? She let out a soft breath, her fingers tightening around his. Not with you. The words hit him harder than he expected. He had spent so long keeping people at arm's length, convincing himself that distance was safer. But Paige had never let him do that. She had walked into his life without hesitation, without asking for permission, and now he couldn't imagine a world where she wasn't there. He lifted his other hand, cupping the side of her face. Her skin was warm beneath his palm, her expression softer than he had ever seen it. I don't want you to leave, he admitted. Paige's lips parted slightly, and for a second, he thought she might say something. Instead, she tipped her chin up, closing the last inch of space between them. The kiss was slow, unhurried, as if neither of them wanted to rush this, as if they both knew how much this moment meant. Her hands slid up his arms, fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt, holding him close. Patrick wasn't sure how long they stood there, wrapped in each other, but when they finally pulled apart, Paige's forehead rested against his, her breath mingling with his own. I wasn't planning on leaving, she murmured. A breath of laughter escaped him, something light and real. Good. She smiled against his skin, and he knew this was it. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't something that would fade once the novelty wore off. This was them. And it always would be. Paige pulled back just enough to look at him, her fingers still resting against his chest. You're not going to disappear on me, are you? The question wasn't lighthearted. It wasn't teasing. It was real. Patrick met her gaze, unwavering. Not a chance. She studied him for a moment longer, as if she needed to be sure. And then, slowly, she nodded. Okay, she said softly. That one word was all it took. Patrick kissed her again. This time with the certainty of someone who knew he wasn't letting go. And neither was she.